What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Roi Ben-Yehuda, and we speak about the role of courage in facilitation and presenting. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. Now, lean back to enjoy the show. And I would like to come back to the warmth. I totally get that. And I wonder, because you mentioned beforehand the negotiation, and that, are you still training negotiation skills, or is this from your academic career?
Both. And I actually just revamped our Next Arrow's negotiation workshop, courageous negotiation workshop, and really excited in sharing it with people. So I love teaching negotiation.
And I wonder, good, to what extent warmth in negotiation can actually be counterproductive or even used in a more manipulative way.
In a more manipulative way?
Yeah, because if you're negotiating, you can collect some points through charisma, through warmth, and shifting the attention away from the arguments, maybe.
Right. I think in most negotiation scenarios, they're technically like a mixed mode of conflict, where you have incentives to compete and incentive to collaborate with the other person. If there is a shadow, like there's a long shadow of the future, if there's a relationship involved, the warmth factor is very, very important, because people are constantly assessing, can I trust this person? And can I collaborate with them? Will they act on their intentions? Do I want to meet with them again? And that's where the warmth factor, are they a friend or are they a foe? Do they have also my interests in mind? Not just their own. Obviously, they have their own concern for themselves, but they also have concern for me and my own interests and my own needs. That's where the warmth factor, I think, is so important. Can it be used in a manipulative way? Of course. Of course. And, you can think about the caricature of the kind of the slimy sales person, like a car sales person. And it's probably a bad rap to like cars sales reps, but people are saying, they will find all kinds of ways to create common identity with you and to compliment you and to just have you like them. And people do that. And of course, people misuse that as a tactic of influence. But you will probably figure out very quickly whether that person is authentic or not.
Yeah, good point. And as you were speaking, I was just thinking that actually, especially in negotiation, the warmth factor is so important, because our brain cannot function and listen to any content if we don't trust each other. And it's through the warmth that we build the first connection. We can relax our animal instincts and then really focus on the other person. Yeah.
That's why, for example, small talk, and it has a bad rap and it's a horrible term for it, like small talk, but it's a bonding ritual, right? It's a relationship audition. That's what small talk is. And it makes a difference. Like, we have research in negotiation that even if you engage in like a 5-minute conversation that's solely dedicated to making some kind of connection with the other person, you are significantly more likely to reach a deal with them in comparison to a control group that, time is money, just get straight to business. So, it is vital from a human perspective to make those connections, especially where there's vulnerability involved, and often in negotiation there is.
Which then basically links back to facilitation, because in a facilitated conversation, we always start with a sort of check-in, which is a warm-up, which is maybe the equivalent of small talk.
Yeah. When you think about the word small talk, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
A waste of time and energy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think, like, a lot of people think about it, but maybe if you reframe it as like a bonding ritual,
yes,
or a relationship audition, there's maybe a different orientation towards it.
And I think then it, again, to link back to what we discussed earlier in the conversation, it links back to the question we are asking. Yeah. So the bonding ritual at the beginning, the check-in, doesn't need to be small talk. It can also be deep talk, without going too deep, But for instance, in Germany, I think most of Europe, one of the small talk topics would be the weather, or would be the public transportation or the traffic situation to drive somewhere.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense, or it doesn't have any purpose, instead of maybe finding commonalities and warming up the vocal cords.
But the commonalities, I wouldn't underestimate the commonalities.
Yeah.
And so we both have this experience of the weather. And so I'm trying to communicate to you that we have something in common, like common grounds, like right away when we do something like that. I agree with you that it wouldn't be my go-to, but even there you can tweak it. So for example, do you remember my first question to you ever?
Mm-hmm.
Do you?
Ever?
Yeah.
This was the exploration call. No, I don't remember that.
I asked you, instead of asking you, how's your day? Which is kind of this perfunctory thing that we do for small talk. I ask you, what's been the highlight of your day?
Yes.
And you were taken aback by that. You paused, you had to think about it. And then you shared with me some personal information, and it went way beyond like, how's your day going? Which isn't really an authentic question, right? So it's making that small tweak. It's like, where are you dialing in from? Somebody comes into your workshop, where are you dialing in from? What's your favorite thing about Portland?
Yeah.
Right? And it's asking that follow-up questions. It's getting a little bit more specific. It's giving people a question that they would like to answer. And
yes.
So even there, you can make it work, I think.
Wonderful example. And it almost sounds like asking for the weather is as fake as the used car dealer trying to make connections, because it's so easy that it almost sounds desperate.
Yeah.
Whereas there are other easy questions that, as you said, that can make the connection. And actually, no, it's the follow-up question that really makes the connection. So the first question might actually be just a warm-up.
Yeah. Yeah. You see a picture of somebody's family, you're asking about a picture of somebody's family, and then you follow up, which is your favorite kid?
Yeah.
Humor. You see, humor is the other aspect to making those connections. But it's a win.
And then the call might be very short.
Come. Yeah.
Good one. Talking about short calls, what makes a workshop fail?
Ooh, that's such an interesting question. If you could read the book, if you could watch the course online, then and gotten the same amount of usefulness, then the workshop failed.
Which is again kind of a waste of time.
It might not even be necessarily a waste of time. You're absolutely right in the sense that if people felt like this was not a good use of my time, that's a huge failure. It could still feel like it was a good use of their time, but they could have gotten it somewhere else, doing something else. And as a facilitator, there's such a rich opportunity when we do a training, because you have so much wisdom, so much knowledge, so much lived experience in that room. And if you don't create, coming back to power with, if you don't create something interesting and novel and challenging together, then you miss that opportunity. And you can't do that with a book alone, and you can't do that if you just watch passively some LinkedIn learning course or something similar, which have value, but it's a different value than a live workshop, be it virtual or in person.
Absolutely. Thank you. +1, +100. And it's almost showing disrespect for the participants, for those who are in the room, if they don't get the chance to speak and contribute.
Yes.
Yeah, because if we're already sharing time and attention with each other, let's share everyone's experience and knowledge for the benefit of all.
+1,000 back. And I think the word that really stands out when you're speaking to me is the word disrespect. And again, thinking about the origin of words, as I mentioned to you in the beginning, like I love studying the origins of word. The Latin origin of the word respect is respectus, which means to see someone again. So spect as in spectacles, to see, see as again. And so you're not actually seeing your audience. You're not seeing them if that's what you're doing in a classroom setting. And that's why it's a disrespect, because I'm not seeing you.
Thank you. I will think more about that. The origins of the word respect and disrespect. I haven't thought of that. Thanks. And I would be curious, as a professor, highly educated, you taught negotiation in classroom at a university. And there you were teaching, I guess. Maybe you used some facilitation skills. And now you're training adults in negotiation skills.
Yeah.
How do you shift gears to keep this open mind? One, also from the ego perspective, to keep an open mind. Okay, we're here to co-create. Yes, I might be the most knowledgeable person in the room about negotiation, and still be open that, okay, there's so much wisdom in the crowd that we want to harvest as well. And how do you also give them the space to contribute and not to sit down and think, well, the professor is here. Who am I to contribute anything?
Yeah, it used to be more of a divide for me. I've kind of fused it together because I really think that the approach that we developed and the skills and the tools in the facilitation world is necessary in the classroom as well. There's a difference, and there's a difference in the power structure, and there's a difference in the amount of time that you meet and in doing homework and how involved the students are and all of that. But right at the outset, I tell them, like, this is going to be a failure if you're not going to be involved. If this is not bi-directional, it's one-directional, then we're not going to succeed. Like, we're doing this together. You have knowledge, you have wisdom, you have perspectives that I care about. I have biases that I want, that we're going to explore as well as you do. And we have that conversation. And I think that's one way to approach that challenge.
So to speak out the invitation?
Yeah. And then act on those intentions, like follow it up. It's one thing to say it.
Yeah, exactly.
Do the opposite. But throughout the semester, people are going to, and especially those initial conditions, there's a lot of research on complex systems, and then it's a field called dynamical systems theory, which show us that those systems are very, very sensitive to initial conditions. How you start something goes a long way in determining its trajectory. And classroom setting and a workshop setting is a complex social system. And so it's very sensitive to beginnings. And you have the beginning, obviously, of the semester, the beginning of the workshop, the beginning of the class. But what you say and what you do in the beginning will influence everything else. And to be consistent, of course, is crucial. The other thing that is, I think, important with using that model of the workshop or the classroom as a complex system is that these systems are not linear. And what I mean by that, there isn't always proportionality between cause and effect. And so the learning is not always going to be obvious. And as a teacher and as a facilitator, you need to be aware of that. And that's why judging the success of a workshop isn't always as easy as giving like a feedback score of how useful this was, or how engaging this was, or how knowledgeable the facilitator was.
Because the penny might drop only months later.
Exactly.
And yeah, I totally see that the way we start goes a long way, and we can make or break it within the first minutes.
Yeah.
I just posted something because for the first time in a long time, I stepped into a virtual workshop and I was welcomed by silence. Well, there was a little bit of music, but otherwise it was just silent. And I felt so awkward. And I'm good with silence. I love to play with silence if it's intentional. And I felt so awkward that I immediately opened some tabs and tried to distract myself because I didn't know where to put myself. Then the workshop was amazing.
Yeah.
And still it induced something into the system that could have been avoided.
Yeah, I think that it probably also depends on like the norms, the cultural norms of that community. Like there are communities that begin in silence as a norm. And so it could have been deliberate. right? And then for us coming in, when we have kind of different norms, like that creates the dissonance that could have been your experience, or it could be something completely different, right? But it's interesting that it turned out to be an amazing workshop. Yeah. I think that's also telling. As a facilitator, sometimes like a version of that is you ask a question and you get crickets, you get silence. And like, what do you do with that? And oftentimes I think there's a lot of pressure that we feel to fill up that silence with noise. But if you wait, something emerges. It's just a matter of having the patience there. I often would actually mention what I just mentioned right now, crack a joke. And I talk about how in grad school, when you first do your dissertation, they put you out there in the classroom and and there's that silence and you really don't know what to do with it. And you feel so awkward and it feels like forever, even though it was like 2 seconds, it feels forever. But then you learn to zip it and see what emerges. And often something emerges. And I say that and then I stop. And in my head, I'll count to 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds. And like clockwork, somebody will summon the courage to speak, and then they'll say something.
Yes. And I think it also has to do with trust and respect towards a group.
Yeah.
So if I give them time to think about it, I show that I really care, that I'm curious and interested in what they have to say, as opposed to I ask a question, nobody answers, I give myself an answer. So I'm actually not really interested. And I honor that it might be challenging as a question. So I give them some time. And trusting that something will come up. And the funny thing is, it always does.
Always does.
And sometimes you have to count longer than 10. And eventually someone will break the silence.
Have you ever done that, Miriam? Have you ever been counting longer than 10?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That feels like an eternity. I salute you.
It does. And it is uncomfortable. And the group somehow appreciates it. Yeah. And then it depends on the audience. So if it's, so I work a lot with facilitators. And then it's a fantastic topic to just address how to use silence and what silence means and the different sounds of silence. Because sometimes people just digest content and need time. And then there's this reflective silence. And then sometimes you have the awkward silence where everyone is like, okay, so what are you doing? This is really awkward. And nobody dares to speak. And then you have the curious silence or just the disengaged silence. Yeah. Nobody cares. You also have a silence. And this is sometimes the loudest.
On that note, I think that we have to be careful around the disengaged silence to not misinterpret what we see. I've learned this the hard way. And I've had workshops where I'm looking at the audience and I'm like, in that internal voice, I'm like, they hate this. This is a waste of their time. Because I'm looking at these faces and they look very disengaged to me. And then I'm looking at the feedback scores afterward, both quantitative and qualitative, and they loved the session. It was very engaging and very useful, and they write all this great stuff. And I'm like, how is there such a disconnect between what I see and what they're writing? And it's anonymous feedback. They have no incentives to be nice to me or to the other facilitators. And I learned to quiet that voice when I see those faces. And maybe they're disengaged, maybe they're not. But I recognize that sometimes it's just people's thinking faces.
The resting bitch face.
Maybe that. But a thinking face isn't always like, scratching your chin or whatever it is. Like sometimes it's just somebody giving you that blank look, and that's them processing information. And we shouldn't read, I think, too much into it. So, and that's still sometimes a challenge. As you mentioned, what are some challenges? Sometimes I'll see that and I'll forget that. And it reminds me, there's a line from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. I don't remember if it was Greek or Roman, but he said that oftentimes it's not things that disturb us, it's our interpretation of things. He didn't say actually oftentimes. He said always. It's not things that disturb us. It's our interpretation of that reality. And as a facilitator, like that is something that often happens. You think it's something objective that's disturbing you. It's really your interpretation of what it is that you're seeing, including that face, including that silence, whatever it may be. And you just got to turn that off and just be present.
Yeah. And then our judgment of ourselves that gets in the way and then suddenly makes it about us instead of the group.
That's right. That's right.
I once spoke with the facilitator and I loved what she said about when participants have their cameras off, that she used to take it personally, or they have the cameras off because they are doing something else. They're distracted. And then she realized that she can just reframe it, that, oh, it might be so early in someone's time zone and being in the workshop and in the session was so important that they didn't have time to make their hair. So they are here anyway. And it's more important than the camera. Or they don't want to be distracted and they're visually sensitive. So they turn the camera off. And I like that, to find ways to just reframe it if we cannot turn the voice off.
Right. So you reframe it, reinterpret the story you're telling yourself. Yeah. That from an emotion regulation perspective is also, I think, a very important thing to do. So I love that.
Because our reaction to the facts, our reaction to our interpretation of the so-called obvious facts will then also impact the group, because you will hear it in someone's voice, whether they feel annoyed or judgmental.
It'll impact your body, your physiology, your emotions, and it'll therefore impact the group for sure.
Yeah. And then the courageous thing to do would then to just voice it.
If it benefits the group, yes. Right. So I agree. If it benefits the group for voicing it, I've been in session where the facilitator is too into like, I'm going to be vulnerable, and they're constantly being vulnerable, and it's really about themselves. It's not the service of the group. And so they're voicing it too much because they're trying to get rid of their own anxiety in this way. And you can say, well, that's in the service of the group, but it doesn't come across that way. But there are other times where voicing it, I think, is in fact in service of the group, of assessing what's happening here, like right now, and changing the dynamics.
Interesting. Yes. Thank you for the distinction. And I think what you said is it in service of the group? So to understand the group and thereby maybe adjusting the process, as opposed to calming my own anxiety by speaking it out. It's a nuance.
Nuance. Yeah.
How do you know? So what's the right level of authenticity?
Are you asking as an audience,
vulnerability,
as an audience member, or like, how do I know if somebody is just vomiting their vulnerability all over us, or as a trainer, as a facilitator?
Both.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think as the audience member, you'll pick it up where you're just like, oh, not again. Like, you have not again. Can you please like get on with it? Like, if you're annoyed by all this vulnerability, I think that might be a sign. For yourself, like, how do you know whether it's in service of the group or not? I'm not sure. I think that you might benefit from asking yourself that question, like, okay, I'm about to do this. How does this serve what I'm trying to do, or what we're trying to create here? And if you can come up with a good answer to that, that is authentic, you're not lying to yourself, then, and it has to be quick, right? Because it's happening live, then that's helpful. It might be like you have a reminder, like an if-then rule, that you ask yourself that question before, or maybe during the break, or whatever it is, or before you ask the question, or before, you share your vulnerability, and that will allow you to assess whether you should or whether you shouldn't. Just asking that question might be useful, but I don't have a good answer to that question. I don't know like how exactly like you discern, and I do agree that it's a fine line. I would say default into asking yourself at least that question. I
agree. And I think if you sense that you have the urge to share that because you feel uncomfortable, and not because you feel uncomfortable about your emotions instead of uncomfortable about the process.
Right. Yeah. That's a nice distinction. And then, of course, let the data speak as well. Look at what people say. Get the feedback. Don't be afraid to get that feedback. Get the feedback, and then look if there's a gap between what you thought and what you got. And if that's the case, then it may cause you to question, like, pressing on the brake in the middle of a session saying, we need to do a 180 right now. We need to assess like what's happening right now. This quiet in the room, like what's that about? Or I understand that you don't want to be here right now. Like whatever it is that someone might say at that moment. And if I'm doing that quite often, then maybe there's a problem in my own perception. And if there's a gap between what I think and what I get, then I probably shouldn't do it as often as I think I should.
Yeah, and I like the provocation in that.
Yeah.
Giving them the chance to say, no, we don't want to be here, or the silence is awkward or disengaged. Yeah.
Miriam, were we recording when you told me the story about you splitting the room up?
I don't think so.
You mind sharing that with the audience, because it's such a powerful example of doing this well. Why
don't you share the story?
Yeah. So before we start recording, you shared with me an example, I think, of you doing this well, and of doing something unusual, of doing something surprising, of breaking a pattern. You had a training. Somebody told you right before the training, nobody wants to be in this training. They're forced to be in this training. And you began by acknowledging that, but you didn't just say it out loud. And you didn't say, okay, here's the door. If you don't want to be here, I'm not going to keep you prisoner. Like, that's not how I do things, which would have been a way of handling it. You asked people to stand up, which is something unusual. And you divided the room and say, I want everybody who wants to be here to be on one side of the room. I want everybody who doesn't want to be here to be on the other side of the room. And so you had this kind of unusual thing. And I'm sure there were some giggles along the way, because you have now a visual representation. You got people to get up, to move their bodies, which is great. And then you if I recall correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, you said those of you who don't want to be here, you brought them to the front. Is that what you did?
No, I actually stood in the corner where I said, those who don't want to be here, come here and stand with me, to basically make it easier for them.
Wait, does that mean that you were on the side that didn't want to be there?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be in this workshop either if you don't want to be here. Fantastic. And then, if I recall correctly, you said, let's just try this out. Let's use this as an experiment. And if after half an hour, or whatever, at break, I don't remember exactly what you said, you don't want to be here, feel free to leave.
Feel free to leave. Yeah. And they all came back, even on time. Thank you for sharing the story on my behalf.
You won them over. This is it. I love this story so much. This is and it takes courage to do what you did. It's spontaneous. It's creative. It's wise. It's example of how we should be doing stuff like this. So, yeah.
Thank you. And just
inspired.
Thank you. Thank you for appreciating. Try it out, and then it's your story.
Right? Yes. Yeah. Well, sometimes we do get this, right? We get, one of my least favorite things to hear from a sponsor is, oh, you should know that so-and-so is in the room and he really or she really does not want to be here. And they're going to let you know it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I don't need to hear that. I don't need to hear that at all, and the reason is not because I get nervous. It's because now there'll be a bias towards that particular person.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm going to pay attention more to that person, and at the expense of other people in the group potentially. And it may impact how I treat them, at the very least, subconsciously, if not consciously.
Yeah.
And I don't want to hear any information about the individuals there, even though I see where that's limited. Because in your example, if you did not hear that information, you wouldn't have begun that way.
Yes. So I think it was general information. It wasn't about the individuals. The same client, they wanted initially, or they even sent me the CVs of all the participants. And then when I arrived, asked me whether I read them. I'm like, no, I don't want to know. And I don't want to know what person is associated with what kind of rank in the hierarchy, because precisely for what you just explained, I don't want to be biased in the way I interact with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't tell me who the CEO is. Yes.
I mean, usually you find out very quickly.
Very quickly.
And the way how you find out will tell you so much about the group and how they relate to each other and what kind of leadership model they're referring to, that there's a lot of information you can gain from that. So I think there's even value in not knowing and trying to guess in the first kind of moments of interaction, and then pointing it out. If you have a leadership or a team building workshop and referring to that, okay, I noticed that nobody's speaking except the CEO, or CEO always starts speaking and then everyone agrees.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. We started with courage, talked about questions and dragons.
Dragons. Here's my dragon.
Yes. And I remember from last time you mentioned dragons and zombies. And before closing, I do want to ask the question, what do zombies have to do with the dragons?
So zombies, that comes from a workshop that we give, an XR called Courageous Presentations. And it's really looking at some of like the deep-seated fears that a lot of us have in both designing and delivering presentations. And so the dragons and zombies are symbolic. And specifically the zombie, it comes from a thought experiment that I came up with in the shower. And the zombie thought experiment is the following. Before you give a presentation, I want you to imagine that a group of zombies attacked your audience. And they went for their brains because that's what zombies like to do. That's what they like to eat. But they're generous zombies, so they left a little bit of brain in each audience member and enough brain space to remember one sentence. That's your zombie statement. That's a phrase. It's the zombie statement. And what will that be? What is the essence of what it is that you're trying to communicate to your audience? What is the gist? And if you can articulate that, then you're going to be more ready to deliver that presentation. And you're going to be more kind to your audience if you can deliver your zombie sentence. So for example, in that workshop, the zombie sentence is you can't slay your presentation until you slay your dragons. And I like that because then you have to figure out what your dragons are. And then you have to think strategically about how will you go about in slaying the dragon or managing your fears or whatever it is that you want to think about. And every workshop that I do, I think about what is my zombie sentence? What is my zombie statement? And how will I communicate that main point to my audience? If they could only remember one thing about what I'm about to say, and oftentimes that's the case, what will that be? And so that's why zombies are with dragons in that particular workshop as a symbol. It's a thought experiment.
I love it. And yeah, the power of storytelling. You could have packaged it differently. You need your audience to remember one sentence and that's it, because they forget all the rest. And yeah, your audience might forget that. Yeah. But the zombie story, nobody's going to forget the story of zombies eating your audience's brain.
Right. Yeah. That's it. It's exactly right. You say you need to come up with like a gist statement. Okay, people will remember that, sort of, maybe, probably not. But if it's like, before every presentation, I got to come up with a zombie sentence and a zombie statement, I think that's more memorable.
I love that. Yeah. And very final question, if I may, since you mentioned this workshop in giving courageous presentations, according to you, in which role do you need more courage? To be the presenter or to be the facilitator?
I think of the presenter as a facilitator. So I'm not thinking about necessarily presentations where it's one direction, it's unidirectional, and you're standing behind some kind of podium, although that may be the case. And in that case, if that's the differentiator, if that's what we're talking about, I'm going to come back to the point that you made, which is it takes more courage to be that presenter, because you're less likely to communicate those questions. You're more likely to feel the need to give answers and statements to your audience. And that is potentially a little bit scarier. There's more risk involved in there. But I think that a good presenter will also be a facilitator. Even in a formal setting, you'll find ways to elicit something out of your audience. And it won't be unidirectional. It won't be in one direction.
Do you have a tip for that? Especially since you spoke about the first impression and how to make sure that you start on a high and win the audience for you?
If you're talking about just like straight up like presentations, yeah, I think that there are a few different things that you can do. I mean, one is have somebody else read your bio. Often people will go up there and then the first thing they'll be like, let me tell you how special I am, because they want to up their power, right?
And the competence next to the warmth.
Next to the warmth, right? Have somebody else do that for you. Because if I'm talking about myself, I may increase my competence but reduce my warmth. And so have somebody else do that for you, I think is one way to do that. I think introducing some right away with finding a way to connect with the audience, some humor, asking questions, even if they're rhetorical questions, getting your audience to move their body even a little bit, like raising their hands in some way or giving them something to do. Like those are all ways of generating some like increasing levels of engagement and connection with your audience, even in more formal settings. Yeah. But again, I do think that doing this well means that you're going to be at least 20% facilitator, even in those settings.
Yeah.
Plant a question.
I was just thinking of that, and pause after asking the question, even if it's a rhetorical question, to pay respect to your audience and to your question, to give them some time at least to think about it.
Yeah. And when you are engaged like with your audience, it's these little things. You see, like, for example, there was a study that was done by Leanne Renninger, who co-founded Life Labs Learning. And she did a study when she was at the University of Vienna on professors. It was a study with a number of professors on their presentation skills. And she had the participants, she wired up so that if the presenter did something that they liked, they press one button. If they did something that they didn't like, they press another button. If it was confused, there was still another button. And she had like all this data about what people found engaging, what they didn't. And she found some really interesting things. Like, for example, when the professors would ask questions, not rhetorical, but actual questions in the formal presentation, they would take a step back from their audience. Now think about like what that communicates to your audience when you take a step back. And then she asked them later as an intervention to take one step forward when you're asking a question. And she saw like the engagement go up. Like people people recognize what was happening there. Because when you're stepping back, you're communicating, this is, I'm afraid of this moment. I'm uncomfortable. I want to move away from you when you're communicating. When you step forward, you're engaging. Obviously, it's not like an uncomfortable, like somebody like zooming in, but just a slight step forward demonstrates, I'm really interested in what you have to say. It demonstrates competence, confidence, and warmth.
Amazing example. And I just remember that from my days in teaching, when I would ask a question that is really important to me, and where I want the students to engage and reveal something about themselves, I would walk around and stand without the podium or anything between me and the students. So the full exposure. And I think I did this unconsciously.
Yeah.
But now with the facilitator, it just occurred to me now with the facilitator's hat on, that's exactly it. You show vulnerability, physically vulnerability, and invite them into that space, showing that you're interested.
Yeah. I had a more of a formal presentation that I gave a few months ago in Las Vegas, and I was on a stage, and there were like, I don't know, 150, 200 people below the stage. And at some point, in maybe 40 minutes into the presentation, I jumped off the stage. Not like in a dramatic way, but I just went off the stage. and I started like moving around the tables. And it changed the whole dynamic of the presentation. Partly because you're injecting surprise and novelty into that moment. People don't expect it. But it changed that hierarchy that we were speaking about earlier, like on high, delivering wisdom to you. Like, no, that's not how I want this moment to go. And then I was able to see people. I was able to make eye contact. I was able to step closer in when I was doing that. And it shifted the whole dynamic. It really did. And so, yeah, as much as we can get rid of that podium, as much as we can get rid of that physical hierarchy that's often created, I think we benefit and our audiences benefit.
And also by you walking through the tables, you invite the audience to move their bodies. So not to stare in the same direction, maybe even lift their heads. So they also see each other and maybe engage with each other just from the movement you're inducing.
Exactly.
Thank you.
And I asked them, I said, do you prefer this or do you prefer me up there? They said this.
What got you to get off the stage?
I'm not used to the stage. So when I go into an office, it's always like an office space. We're closer together. I'm not elevated physically in this way. And it just felt unnatural. It felt comfortable for me to be up there. I saw like what was happening as far as the dynamics, and I wanted to shift it.
Awesome. Also courageous.
Takes a little bit of courage. Yeah. I could have fallen.
Maybe someone would have held you, catch you. Then you would be a rock star.
Yeah. I often like to think of myself as a rock star. And you can learn, by the way, maybe we'll end on this. Like from rock stars, you can learn a lot. I'm going to see in a week one of my favorite heavy metal group, and for many, many, many decades has been my favorite group, as Iron Maiden. And
they still exist.
They still exist. They still sell out arenas and stadiums, and they still create new music as well. But what you can learn from them, I think, as a presenter, is quite a lot. Not just Iron Maiden, but rock concerts. Think about how rock concerts begin. Think about how they go through. Think about how they end. The end of it is never, let me share with you some new material that I'm working on. Right? It's the encore. It's something people really, really want. They end on a way they leave people super excited. It's the dessert.
They sing together. So they have the connection. Yeah.
Create that, right? And think about it when you facilitate a meeting. Like, how do you want the meeting to end? Do you want to end with just with like, all right, so here are like the next steps, you know, and then it just kind of ends with like just like a thud? Okay. Or do you want to end in a way that's more exciting, more engaging, more optimistic, more inspiring for people together? Same thing with how you structure the beginning of it, the middle of it. There's so much you can learn from what rock bands do in concerts that'll help us become better meeting facilitators and facilitators in general. In the same way of how chefs structure a meal, like the dessert, the main course, the appetizer, the main course, and the dessert. That's how you should structure your presentation as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also to avoid the strong differences. So maybe you get something to clean up the mouth, or to some bread in between, or something to neutralize the taste. That's what I mean, not clean.
Exactly. And it aligns with this, like the research on the primacy and the recency effect as well. So you can so people are much more likely to remember what you do in the beginning, what you do in the end. So you make multiple beginning, middles, and ends throughout the presentation. I learned that from chefs. I learned that from rock stars, from Iron Maiden.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What a rich conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
What would be the zombie sentence that you want the audience to leave this conversation with? And you can make one up.
Well, I would have to make one up since I've never had this conversation before. Miriam, I'm going to pass that question to you, and then I'll add one, because I'm not avoiding the question. The reason is I've noticed that you are very good at kind of finding, not just summarizing like kind of the main points, but like finding the essence of what somebody says. You do it when you echo and play back what it is you hear your interviewees say to you. And you do it when you summarize things on LinkedIn. Like, I see you constantly doing that. So I think you're probably very good at coming up with zombie sentences. So I'm wondering what comes to your mind. And if you want me to go first, I'll go first. But I would love to hear from you.
After this introduction, and no pressure. I think my zombie sentence would be that it pays off to fight the dragons, to be more courageous and ask more closed questions. I think these were, I was maybe cheating, because I think these were the big themes or big topics that I'm taking away as nuggets from this conversation.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. For me, I'm thinking about how we talked about courage and thinking about how you can't achieve excellence as a facilitator without courage. And that would be my dragon statement or sentence for our talk.
Beautiful. I like yours.
I like yours too.
Thank you, Roy. What a pleasure.
Indeed.
Thank you for staying tuned and for listening to the show. I know how busy you are, and I appreciate that you're sharing your two most valuable resources with me and my guest, your time and your attention. If you're looking for more conversation with other facilitators and for a community of practice, why don't you join Never Done Before, the community that I have built, and many of my podcast guests are already members. Visit neverdonebefore.org, and I wish to see you there.